Thank you, Stefan, and it's a very great pleasure to be here, and I just want to thank everyone who's done the considerable amount of work that's made this event, Congress as a whole, and this keynote, and my concert later possible. Thank you again. This is not working. Here we go. The starting point for this paper comes from a passage in the 2013 book, Beyond the Score, Music as Performance by Nicholas Cook. He is building on something, a commentary on Charles Rosen's quite critical view of historically informed performance. On the basis of this, he coins the term, which I've not heard in this, I've not seen in this form anywhere before. Cook used it in 2013, analytically informed performance. Whereas in HIP, historically informed performance, the interaction between scholarship and performance has always taken place in the studio, rehearsal room, and concert hall, with scholars often serving as consultants to performers. Interactions between theorists and performers have tended to take place on campus, on the scholars' turf. More than HIP, what I shall term AIP, has been pursued within the context of academic epistemologies, modes of dissemination, and criteria for evaluation. An obvious reason for this difference is that there is not a distinctive AIP audience in the way that there is a HIP one. And he goes on from this to look at, for example, the work of Edward T. Cohn, which I'm about to sort of consider as well, and in place of a relationship for analysis and performance such as he has observed in existing texts, he suggests that one such as has been found between theory and composition might be more fruitful and more pluralistic. I wouldn't disagree with that, but I would dispute his view that somehow analytically informed performance as it exists already excludes that, or that some of those involved in it would somehow be hostile to that. Anyhow, here is my response in a review article of Beyond the Score, which I published in 2017. The name of this was a response to an earlier article by John Rink called The State of Play and Performance Studies, which I felt was interesting but didn't even encompass all the range of work in performance studies done at the time. I think it was around 2000, when Rink published his article. So I consider, very critically I have to say, Cook's book there in the context of how I think the whole field of performance studies has developed, or how it existed in 2017 economic writing. So I say that Cook notes disparagingly that in the work of Wallace Berry, practice is subordinated to theory. But of what performance is this not in some sense the case? What teachers preach and performers follow, even the conservatoire, are theories. The issue is one of the degree of critical reflection that is entailed in that very process. And Cook coins the term AIP, which, as said, and I quote there, has been pursued within the context of academic epistemologies, modes of dissemination, and criteria for evaluation. Now, I link this concept of AIP to another concept which recurs in that book, the idea of structureless performance, which he uses pretty much synonymously with the idea of modernist performance. And he particularly links Heinrich Schenker's writings to modernist performance. It's a very idiosyncratic idea of what modernism is that you find in this book, and I don't think one that's particularly consistent. But I think the term modernism has, has frequently been used in far too unspecific a manner, and often used to the term, which to me encompasses a wide range of quite plural tendencies with only questionable unity between them. Many writers, I think, have used those to isolate one or two tendencies and then use those to often condemn almost anything that falls within that umbrella. If you're interested in more in that, you might read my latest review article called Modernist Fantasias, the recuperation concept, which is out in the latest issue of the Journal of the Royal Musical Association. But Cook says here that this structuralist or modernist performance should be seen as a historical style and not the paradigm for performance in general, as which it has been widely represented in music theoretical and pedagogical circles. Quite characteristically, he doesn't give that many examples, if any, of where it has been represented as such a general paradigm. So my response is to say I don't know what a non-structuralist performance would be. A performance with no structure? In some sense, all performers do articulate some structural aspects of a piece, whether wittingly or not. This can be the result of very conscious analytical decisions, or perhaps more spontaneous or intuitive perceptions, but that doesn't make them any less structural as a result. In chapter 7 of the book, Cook is very sceptical as to whether large-scale structure is, quote, the most productive place to look for the emergence of musical meaning. And he cites something by his colleague, Daniel Leach Wilkinson, which cautions performers to start listening, says they should not be listening to music theorists, and especially not when it comes to issues of large-scale structure, because Leach Wilkinson does not believe this is an important or even valid consideration for performance. This is very prescriptive. I say that every performer has to make decisions about such long-range factors as relative dynamics, tempos, use of different sounds and different textures at strategic points in the music they play. And that to maintain an analytical work could never fruitfully inform performance in this respect appears like bad conscience or even musicological anti-intellectualism. I cite here an article in Early Music magazine by Tim Carter, where he is looking at the discrepancy between what a lot of musicologists write and say in terms of performance and what the view about the priorities of performances are that he encounters among students. And he came across many that think that the thing that you should do as a performer is, first of all, play the notes, and then on top of that, just add a dose of sincerity and reverence. Hey presto, you have an interpretation. Now, I would say that students who take this sort of view, which I think is best to be called naive, would nonetheless be just as dismissive of the work of Cook or Leach Wilkinson and other colleagues at the Centre for the History and Analysis of Recorded Music, which was a research grouping which was formed in the 2000s by them, as they would be of the work that Charm is trying to tell people to disregard in favour of their own work. If you're telling performers to ignore musicology, it's not a wise thing to do if you're a musicologist. In 2011, I took part in a roundtable in a study day on performing musicology. This was at my own institution, the City University of London. A roundtable together with Daniel Leach Wilkinson and John Rick, both colleagues of Cook in Charm. Charm was superseded by another research group in CNPCP, also to do with the study of performance and related to recordings, but the grouping of the key figures there remains the same. Now, Leach Wilkinson gave a statement at the roundtable, given with a certain demeanour of affected aristocratic disdain, feigning horror at a phenomenon by which performers were supposedly starting to pay attention to musicologists, and this was affecting the nature of their performances. To Leach Wilkinson, this was thoroughly wrong. He preferred the unmediated, instinctive responses of those performers unsullied by such decadent intellectualism. And so, in contrast, he played a recording of Chopin, played by Alfred Cortot, as an example of the type of golden age performance which he favoured before the rot set in, when musicologists got their hands on performance. I would say Cortot became a type of noble savage performer for Leach Wilkinson, and the audience there could marvel how he's lost in rapture at this, before returning to quite characteristic Anglophone anti-intellectual invective. A further aspect of the latter was a predictable and almost mannered attack on the authoritarian nature of musicological discourse, though when pushed by me, H. Wilkinson refused to consider that any comparably authoritarian or hierarchical culture might intrude upon the world of the conservatoire. Now, just to give a little bit of background of some of my own activities, I've actually, aside of my playing and musicological research, I've also undertaken a considerable amount of research and activism into many incidences of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse taking place in conservatoires and specialist music schools, marred to a rigid set of values in which prestigious teachers are assigned a type of total power over students, free to manipulate, bully, and humiliate them on a regular basis, and in some cases, brutally assault them as well. Whilst the managements in such institutions have threatened students with dismissal and destruction of career prospects if they dare to report such things. If anyone wishes to know more about specific cases in this respect, which have been fully documented in the context of criminal trials, I'd be happy to say more during questions. But it's for that reason I wholly reject the attitudes of Leach Wilkinson and the implied hierarchy between a conservatoire supposedly allowing freedom and development of itself compared to the authoritarian world of the university. And he expressed that in various writings, but he has tempered it in some more recent ones. So in 2011, he greatly admired many great performers who could do no wrong, but concentrated his ire upon musicologists who suggested to performers, for example, that the nature of various harmonic processes in works of music might suggest emphasizing certain moments in their performances. Not what I would say is a great crime. Leach Wilkinson's view is echoed in Cook's recent writings and some of Rink's, and they all share a quite obsessive disdain for what they construct variously as structuralism and or modernism, which has supposedly corroded the earlier 20th century traditions they lie on. Both Leach, Wilkinson and Cook's disdain for musical input into performance, and I note here that Cook makes disparaging what I would call strawman comments about how historically for performance, quote, the net effect was to subjugate the practice of performance to the regime of scholarship and the written word. That's in an essay on empirical musicology, multidisciplinary performance studies, as if that's what historical performance did. But I'd say that's so their disdain for musical input presumably does not apply to their own work. Or if it does, then such work can comfortably be avoided by such performance. What I'm going to do is look at some key texts on analysis and performance, give a brief overview of Cook's own changing relationship to musical analysis, and mount a defense of the relevance of analysis to performance, and also argue this is far from being a particular recent phenomenon, if the concepts are framed broadly. If I focus on Cook, who will feature prominently in another forthcoming review article of mine, and also a book chapter which places his work at the centre of some tendencies in recent British musicology, that's not because of, certainly not because of reverence, but actually concern for the highly didactic nature, especially of this recent work, with quite cavalier dismissals of whole fields of scholarship and indeed performance proceeding from different assumptions. Such critiques are not always undertaken from a position of real familiarity, but there can be a tendency to lionize other scholars, regardless of whether their merits or otherwise their work, simply because they hold to the same ideological line, in a manner which I believe has created very real and often very inept new hierarchies within the world of musicology. A former Regius Professor of Music at the University of Cambridge certainly deserves to be subject to more of a critical perspective than would be customary, not least because of acolytes whose own careers have earned a fair amount of his patronage, and thus perhaps not the ones most likely to put forward such a critical perspective. So, for reasons of time, I shall put to one side important works, some of which are only in sketch form, relating to performance with an analytical component by Heinrich Schenker, Theodor Adorno, or Rudolf Kolisch, and instead I want to concentrate on a body of more recent work. One of the first major book-length studies of analysis and performance was Edward T. Cohn's Musical Form and Musical Performance, which was published in 1968 and based upon a series of lectures that he gave at Oberlin College in 1967. Cohn focused initially in particular on issues of timing, not least relating to gaps between sections or movements of the piece, and how one might gauge those according to a sense of how those parts related to the whole. Amongst his other interesting perceptions was that, he said, active listening is, after all, a kind of vicarious performance, effected, as Roger Sessions puts it, by inwardly reproducing the music, which, I take it, is also what Hindemith means by mental co-construction. This dignifies the listener with a creative rather than purely analytical role, and by implication stresses the creative nature of analysis itself for what is active listening, if not some type of oral analysis. Cohen was also sceptical about the idea of an ideal or perfect interpretation, recognizing the extent to which this corresponded to some Platonic idea of the music. Otherwise, Cohen focused on some quite fundamental aspects of basic musical diction, offering suggestions to how, for example, certain phrases or sub-phrases in the Mozart sonata might be emphasized or de-emphasized by a performer in light of an informed view of their function in terms of harmony and voice speaking. Looking at the Chopin C minor prelude, Cohen recognized multiple analytical readings of the bass lines and concomitant choices available to performers so that no interpretation in this respect would be exhaustive. You could never contain all the possible analyses in any one performance. In the A major prelude of Chopin, he discerned ways in which one half of the piece can be read as a diminution of the other, and suggested means to emphasize certain bars to make this clear. Cohen even considered performance of electronic music, which is rather studiously avoided in Cook's later writings, and how this changes conceptions of the nature of what performance is, and the centrality of performance, which would be later asserted by Cook. And in the third main section of that book, Cohen considered the limitations of overarching stereotypical conceptions of particular composers and the corresponding demands for performance. How it was required that one should play Beethoven passionately, Mozart classically, Schumann romantically, and so on. And he noted a problematic implied historical teleology of increasing freedom for the performance until that was frustrated by the metronomic dictates of Stravinsky. But why is this relevant to what I'm saying here? Is he considered from this a dialectic between style, as something common to a whole body of works, and form, which is unique to a particular work. Cohen did not relate that to performance, but this dichotomy is something I will return to presently. Cohen's work was quite non-didactic. He rarely, if ever, attempted to prescribe a singular approach to interpretation, but instead drew upon information from score-based analysis to suggest new possibilities for performance strategies. Nothing in the book suggests to me other than that he was seeking creative and meaningful approaches to the very act of performance, which yielded stimuli of considerable subtlety and insight. But that area of scholarship lay relatively dormant for some time, until the appearance of a few pieces of writing in the 1980s by Joel Lester and Jenna Schnalfelt, and then the appearance of Wallace Berry's Musical Structure and Performance in 1989. That's a much more extended book than Cohen's, and much more detailed, and so it's something I would only focus on parts of. But from the very outset, Berry was careful, quote, not to deny that intuitively informed performance is often convincing, as, for example, when a gifted interpreter, out of long and profound experience, relatively spontaneously finds the right tempo or dynamic inflection. Nonetheless, Berry felt this was relatively rare, and he argued that analysis might facilitate such a process. He also recognized that the relationship between analysis and interpretive decisions was far from straightforward, and remarked that analysis tempers the purely subjective impulse, resolves unavoidable dilemmas, and offers means by which the teacher can articulate ideas persuasively and rationally. Like Schenker before him, he was as concerned with pedagogy as he was with performance. Key aspects of interpretation for Berry included, in particular, tempo and its modifications, and articulation. while key analytical concerns related to musical structure, and within this, function, which he defined as the place and processive role of any given event in an identifiable direct tendency. At the same time, he recognized the importance of, quote, surface and near-surface detail, a piece of individuating, comparatively dense network of foreground and middle ground lines, and the immediacy of those elements for listeners. Nonetheless, he thought they should be informed, at least, by a wider perception of the whole. He said, pianists, singers, conductors, and other performers make choices, and to deny that these ought to have reasoned bases would seem to negate the imperative of rationality itself, a value by which, at least in more civilized moments, we like to think ourselves guided. Intuition was certainly valid to Berry, but it could also be, quote, a capricious guide and is clearly inadequate in solving problems, as when a performer faces a dilemma respecting tempo articulation, and where interpretive choice needs to be underscored with explanation and substantiation, as in teaching. I think he's going too far there, but never mind. But he also viewed as scarcely disputable a comment that came from Schmalfeld. She had said, there is no single one and only performance decision that can be dictated by an analytical observation. So, amongst having put these ideas into practice, Berry looked at some basic textual issues of the correct pitch in works of Beethoven and Chopin, and used analytical means to answer things, as others have done, such as the famed example of whether a note is A natural or A sharp in the lead up to the recapitulation of Beethoven's Hammer Clavier Sonata. Berry decided it was definitely A natural on the grounds of the vital function of chromatic voice use. Elsewhere, he considered Schenker's conclusions on how dynamic shading may help to articulate intervallic progressions, and also the vitality of emphasizing chromatic alterations. And he was sympathetic to these ideas of Schenker that did not necessarily embrace Schenker's derogation of general rules. He suggested how players might emphasize particular notes to bring out voice reading in a song a few were off, and considered whether, in a Beethoven symphony, the conductor might underline a type of written-out acceleration through motive, which was achieved in the scores through motivic fragmentation and imitation structure. They might underline this by adding a literal acceleration to tempo, but he also asked maybe the processors do this sufficiently already for the work. Use the term similar to does the music speak for itself there. I think it's a key question, interpretation. But I would add a third possibility to the two offered by Berry. The interpreter might do something distinct from the process applied by the score, either as an act of caprice, or in order to create a distinct and dialectical perspective. In the case of Beethoven, this is the D major symphony, the conductor could actually slow down rather than speed up in order to bring the stretto processes into closer focus. An idiosyncratic possibility, but not one to wholly discount. Berry undertakes an extremely detailed analysis of Debussy's songs, say l'Express or Envelops, the first is the Ariette Oubliée, in which he considers the basic tonal idiom, the metrical and rhyming structure of the poem, as well as its use of sound images, formal divisions and delineators in music, both vertical and horizontal motivic components, the relationship between melody and accompaniment, and various others. And on the basis of that analysis, throughout he keeps deriving conclusions about tempo, dynamics, and other aspects of performance. Now, a year prior to the appearance of Berry's book, Eugene Nama published another much remarked upon essay on the relationship of analytical theory to performance interpretation. Nama considered what he thought was naivety of a view by which the performer's responsibility lie wholly in terms of the composer. I'm articulating some of these points about these because I think a lot of the subtleties in these writings are often rather overridden in some of the recent critical commentaries. So, if I think that Nama possibly overstated the extent to which performers have traditionally been thought that they have a responsibility solely to the composer. Nonetheless, in contrast to that, the model he presents, a tripartite model of an interrelationship between composer, performer and listener, in which the performer brings to bear upon a work their own aesthetic beliefs, experience of style and learning tradition, but should consider not only the wishes of the composer, as far as those can be discerned, but also the sensibility of the audience. That's in many ways a positive model. But more than Barry, and certainly more than Cohn, Narmer went on quite prescriptively to look negatively at, for example, performances of Brahms's Intermezzo Opus 118, number 1. And in particular, he disliked those performances which did not connect the opening 3-note stepwise descending figure in the treble to the following chord in the bass. Narmer's argument was that the last note of the treble motive ended on a weak sixth, while the crotchet motion implied the music move into the next bar, not to mention the accent on the left-hand chord, and so it's part of a 4-note phrase there. And furthermore, looking at the very end of the piece, which I put up there, he said that this last cadence is said to confirm this pattern. Narmer thought pianists were too concerned to bring out the arpeggios, and lost a sense of the 4-note motive, and he didn't hesitate to criticise someone like Julius Katchen's respect. I'll play you some of the approaches that one can take to this. So, the bad, according to Narmer, that is demonstrated conclusively in his view. I cannot agree unequivocally with Narmer on this, because I think that Brahms's phrasing does suggest a fragmented motive which only incidentally connects with the left hand. Now you do have something clearly leading onto a chord, but I think there is, at least as a possibility, there is potential value in an approach where that relationship between the first 3-note motive and the chord is more incidental, so that it creates a sense of a latent relationship, which is only finally made manifest in the last bars. So the music is in a state of becoming rather than necessarily being, if to use the later terms that Schalfeld herself employs. All I'm saying is that there are other options as well as the one that Narmer seems to think is right. He also considered the conception of melodic non-closure and how particular interdialectic content creates melodic implications. And quite interestingly, he looked at analytically at the overture to Handel's Messiah and how some analytical considerations might inform whether or not one uses double-dotted rhythms here. And this is another case of what's implied in Cohn, generalized style and the particularities of individual works existing in a dialectical relationship. On that basis, he arrived at value judgments relating to the performance of the work, definitely favouring the double-dotted approach. And in a more extended section, he looked at how some of Richard Strauss's writing in Der Rosenkavalier can actually be viewed as counterintuitive in terms of the use of contour dynamics and what the implications for performance might be. He did a quite detailed evaluation of different performances, giving them rankings according to his analytical perceptions. That work can certainly be read as prescriptive. An analyst attempting to tell performers what they are allowed to do. But I prefer to read it as simply one writer giving their own view, which readers and performers are free to accept or dispute. And certainly I believe that some of Nama's insights could be most valuable for performers approaching any of the scores in question, whether or not they necessarily share all of his conclusions. Now I just want to, before I talk about Nicholas Cook, I just want to give you a bit of background as to the state of musical analysis in the United Kingdom. For a long period, it's never had the same status, nor was often pursued with the same degree of rigour as in the United States. I'm talking about within the post-1945 era here. And only a few musicologists really had a lot vested into bringing more systematic analysis into the scholarly climate there. Most notable of whom were Arnold Whittle, who took up a position as a professor of theory analysis at King's College London in, I think it was around 1980, and also his younger colleague Jonathan Dunsby. Together they created the Society for Music Analysis, the Journal of Music Analysis, and then they wrote what I think is a very important book on music analysis, albeit it's now somewhat dated. It was published in the mid-1980s. I should declare an interest here because I am a trustee of the Society for Music Analysis, so I'm obviously going to be quite biased on that front. But as Whittle and Dunsby were achieving something in terms of getting systematic analysis recognised as a valuable aspect of musicological study, at the same time the young Nicholas Cook was starting to publish his work. And in particular his first book, A Guide to Music Analysis, which came out soon after Whittle and Dunsby. And ever since then, you could say that these two schools of thinking on music analysis have existed in quite antagonistic competition. So on this slide, I have put what I think are Cook's principal publications relating to performance. My apologies for the lack of justification on the 2007. There should be an extra tab there. Cook's a very prolific writer. He's published many books and many articles and book chapters. So I'm just concentrating on those that I think are most relevant to classes. To give you a briefest of overviews of these. Both A Guide to Music Analysis and the book Music, Imagination and Culture. I'm not talking about music analysis in the listener. Partially, it's very little known. It's really a version of Cook's doctoral thesis and has not had much impact, so I will leave that out. Whereas most of the other books have been very widely read and cited. So both The Guide to Music Analysis and Music, Imagination and Culture consist in large measure of critical summaries of others' analyses. Original analyses are quite rare and they're certainly not extended. Much of Cook's original content is relatively general or consists of passing observation. To some extent, this is also true of analysing musical multimedia, which I think for a long time Cook himself would have viewed as his magnum opus, trying to present models of how to deal with the interactions between sound and visual images or other aspects of multimedia work. But there are some definite original passages in there, such as his now quite famed analysis of Madonna's Material Girl, or a cinematic step-by-step overview of the sequences in Walt Disney's Fantasia, to accompany a consideration of the use of Stravinsky's music there. The situation is somewhat different in analysis through composition, which contains a fair amount of original content, but it's designed more, and quite explicitly, as an introductory textbook for students of basic elements of the classical style, rather than more in-depth analyses. He says in the introduction to this book, he brings up a theme which I have written about and continue to write about, called de-skilling of musicology. The reduction of what were once seen as core basic skills that those entering university or leaving university could be expected to have. And he recognised that with supposed broadening of the curriculum at school to encompass other musics, fewer students were arriving with sort of knowledge of how the classical style worked that once could have been expected. And so he designed this book very recently as a way of compensating for that. But I'd have to say, for someone who's written so much on analysis, it would be difficult to identify any major extended analyses that have been influential by Cook. And this process of essentially providing commentaries on other work became clearer in the first decade of the 21st century as he moved away from analysis for a while and was more occupied with a type of meta-musicology and would write on the widest range of different musicological subjects, to the point where there were not many collections of essays published in the UK which didn't have a chapter by him. And in this position, he was able to bestow a lot of patronage upon favoured scholars. But then in 2000, I have another interesting player here, because after a career as a performer, it was Cook himself who invited me to apply for a research fellowship at the University of Southampton. So I owe something to him, even if I've turned perhaps more critical towards his work than I was then. But in the 2010s, Cook focused upon performance, and he took harsher views of the relationship between this analysis than had been the case in some of his important earlier writings. Now, there are many issues, both methodological and ideological, that I do have with Cook's work. He is profoundly unsympathetic to new music, and also to a great many writers of continental musicology, even to the point of accusing one French musicologist of reiterating, and I quote here, the Nazi creed of blood and soil when she criticised his eschewal of any socially critical function of music. He said that this musicologist, that her work belonged in the critique of capitalism and consumerism that existed in the 19th century and led to the Nazi creed of blood and soil. I find that absolutely reprehensible. And it relates to a paradigm that my friend the musicologist Paul Harper Scott has put, which he calls the EGN equation. E is Europeans, G is Germans, N is Nazis. And he finds this predominant in a lot of Anglophone musicology, that writers slip from broad characterizations of most continental Europeans to equating them all with Germans, and then almost inevitably the link to Nazis comes along. This is not one of the most edifying aspects of our profession. Cook's critiques of historically informed performance do not really demonstrate knowledge of the wider history of the movement, which he thinks does not begin until the late 1960s. I would date it back at least to François-Joseph Baptiste's work in the 1830s. And nor is his rhetoric about that movement generally matched by the sort of data which might be achievable through a wide range of listening, and perhaps also proper study of relevant writings, interviews, sources, and so on. At a recent talk which Cook gave at my own university, he did admit under questions that his knowledge was limited of medieval music, of historical performance. He did not seem to understand the concept of free improvisation, and remained resolutely oblivious to studio composition, whilst could not name a single analyst who supposedly epitomised some of the same tendencies he associated with serial music. But none of this prevented him from making broad pronouncements on all of those subjects. And so I find those claims relatively unsubstantiated and hollow, and do not fulfil basic scholarly criteria, if one includes amongst these evidence of sustained engagement with an area before presenting sweeping interpretations of the area as a whole, or not ignoring inconvenient phenomena which do not sit easily with the overarching arguments one wishes to make. Those same problems reappear, albeit somewhat less starkly, in Cook's writings on analysis and performance. In the essay, which I think is key, Analysing Performance and Performing Analysis, which has been published in essentially the same essay in 3 different forms, in different places. The arguments are basically the same, the difference is just details. He focuses, I'm talking now about the version in Rethinking Music. He focuses on Berry's work, and with particular critique. He says, performers, it seems, have a great deal to learn from analysis. The possibility of a reciprocal process of learning is apparently not considered. Nano is viewed as an even more extreme example, and he cites the writer Tim Howell as calling such writing authoritarian, whilst Cox views the work of Fred Lerdahl and some of Schenker and what he characterizes as structuralist music theory in general is of a similar nature. I do not believe this work is any more authoritarian than anything else involving some type of value judgment. Barry and Nama's conclusions are far from arbitrary or uninformed, even though their applicability to some repertoire may be limited. Cook thinks that, quote, Lerdahl and Nama both eliminate the musician as an individual and replace him or her by a theory whose input is some kind of musical text and whose ultimate output is an aesthetic judgment. As an alternative to that view, I would say that Lerdahl and Nama are acting in the manner of performers in their analyses. They're imagining ways of performing the music on the basis of responses to musical texts. Nonetheless, Cook does go on to think about how analysts might learn from what performers actually do rather than what they think they should, and that's certainly something I would wholeheartedly endorse as an important dimension. And I would go even a step further to say that a score-based analysis is almost invariably an analysis of a potential performance. That whatever an analyst thinks they are just deriving from the score relates to imagining it being performed in a certain manner. So I don't really think you can take performance out of analysis entirely at all. But by the time of Beyond the Score, however, after following Cook's move away from analysis in the 2000s, the view had become much more negative, and that was foreshadowed in some of his wider methodological writings. Analysis became viewed as one of these negative continental tendencies and was viewed as hegemonic or tied up with a particular version of a certain repertoire and so on. And so that led to things like the opening quotation. The possibility of a fruitful dialogue between analysts and performers has disappeared, though the weight of Cook's negative judgment, which is surely as authoritarian as any of those he critiques, was much more strongly weighted against analysts right back in the 1999 essay. I want to shift onto another question now, which hopefully you see the relevance to analysis performance. In the famed essay Bach gave designer Liebhaber verteidigt, Bach defended against his devotees, Theodor Adorno argued against a type of mechanical performance of mechanical and historically informed performance of Bach, which he observed at the time, and he said about those who played it in such a way, he said, they say Bach and mean Telemann and are secretly in agreement with the regression of musical consciousness, which even without them remains a constant threat under the pressures of the culture industry. There's a very interesting commentary on this essay by the historian Toby Thacker, who situates it in the context of the 200th anniversary of Bach's death and how this was celebrated very differently in both West and East Germany, where those in the West were trying to turn Bach into a timeless figure outside of history. Some in the East were somehow trying to reinvent him as a sort of proto-communist. Neither of these views really are that convincing. But Adorno said that many of those celebrating Bach's work at the time, quote, have made him into a composer for organ festivals in well-preserved Baroque towns, into ideology. You can find similar views in Adorno's sketch for a theory of musical reproduction. There is, he has a disdain for both performers and performances, which reduce the particular to the general, which reduce Bach to just one of many other Baroque composers. And this, I would say, maps onto Cohn's dichotomy of style and form, and can be said to differentiate historically informed from analytically informed performance. Now, I just qualify that by saying I think it would be too simplistic and crude to claim that historically informed performance deals only with issues of period style, and instruments, techniques, seating, and so on, as various such work does draw upon historical documentation relevant to specific works and their specific historical performances. But nonetheless, approaches derived from work-immanent analysis are important counterbalances to re-emphasize the particularity of remarkable works of music and their specific demands in performance. But I would say that latter approach is not necessarily anything new. Very few performances of any value could not be said to entail some type of response to the particularities of their scores. All performers need to make some decisions on tempo and tempo modification, on articulation, voicing or balance, rhythmic nuance, timbre, and so on. Elsewhere, I've written about the subject of practice as research related to performance. And I'm pointing out that you cannot play a piece without making some such decisions. I frame these literally as research questions. And the question then is, what sort of methodology does one use to arrive at some answers, which will then be embodied in the final performance, which is the research output. It may seem a rather contorted way of framing performance in terms of the boxes one has to tick if working in a university, and perhaps there's some extent to this. This essay was a response to something by the British composer John Croft, where he argued composition is not research. I would say composition and performance can be, and often have been, research. But what I wanted to highlight, and I hope this is productive, is the extent to which performance involves choices, and creative and rational and synthetic choices. And the question is how, on what basis one makes those choices. How one shapes a phrase is surely based upon perceptions of its melodic contour and or the harmonic function of particular pitches, perhaps also the relationship to other phrases in the work. That is, in the broader sense of the term, analytical information which is feeding into performance. Even quite spontaneous and capricious interpretive decisions are not often wholly divorced from any consideration of the score. And I think it would certainly be erroneous to imagine that many renowned musicians of past eras were oblivious to analytical or music theoretic considerations, as so many of them benefited from a rich and rigorous musical education over and above their more focused training of performance, and brought a consequent level of insight and perception to the music they played as a result. To see a figure like Vladimir Horowitz as some sort of performing monkeys, it does no justice at all to the wide range of erudition and knowledge he brought to the music he performed. Every bit as much as other ones who'd be marketed as more intellectual performers, in my view. The implied view of Leach Wilkinson and others of older performers inhabiting some realm free from such theoretical and analytical corruption is little more than a romanticised view of a golden age. Perhaps the only real exceptions were very literalist or objectivist performers such as Arturo Toscanini, Bruno Walter, Walter Gieseking or Hermann Scherchen, who were primarily concerned with the letter of the text they interpreted, rather than somehow trying to articulate some things which could be said to lie beneath the surface for all the problems of that metaphor. Examples such as those described by Cook, listed on my previous page, the 1995 essay The Conductor and the Theorist, of Wilhelm Furtwängler drawing upon the work of Heinrich Schenker, are really unusual or striking because at the time Schenker's theories were themselves quite unusual and had not yet won widespread acceptance. So in a broad sense, analytically informed performance is a long-established practice. What is different about the work of Cohn, Berry, Narmer and others is the extent to which they sometimes draw upon more systematic approaches to such analysis. If one believes analysis can provide important and valuable information related to musical scores, as I certainly do, then why should performers not draw upon this? Certainly, of course. And I just want to say a tiny bit about a model of notation that I outlined in a 2009 essay. I haven't put it up on here, but if anyone wants to know, find it. It's also on my, if anyone looks at my Sick Research Online page, most of my essays are available there. This came from a lot of experience of playing quite complex contemporary scores, and I was struck by how many people imagined that if one wants to play something like the work of Brian Fermiho, that this is so complex, so detailed, that it leaves no space for any sort of creative role on the part of the performer, which was not in keeping with how my own experience of learning the work and other very complex works was like. And I realised the reason that that model held so much sort of theoretical cogency for me was because the score was imagined as implying a particular result upon which one might superimpose interpretive decisions. And that was not how I saw it. So I framed I'm looking into the microphone here. I framed a view whereby notation does not really tell you what to do, but it tells you what not to do. So that if someone writes a B natural, if you're playing it on a non-discretely tuned instrument, so obviously not the piano, that means it's not a B flat, it's not a C, it's not a B quarter sharp, or a B quarter flat either. But there is some realm for maneuver on a stringed instrument. There are possibilities of expressive intonation, there are different tuning systems and so on. So instead of saying this is what a B natural is, it circumscribes a range of possibilities for what one might play. This is even clearer when one looks at rhythm. Because, I mean, on a piano, a B natural is simply a B natural. There's only one note you can press. But if there is a triplet, interpreting a triplet as three metrically exactly even notes is, in my view, just one way of reading such a figure, and in many ways not in keeping with a large number of performing traditions in which this would be played with differential durations for the three notes. So instead of taking those things as being deviations, one should consider the fact that a triplet could imply a variety of stylized possibilities, and doesn't imply a singular thing, but just a range of things only to be judged by how far would it be pushed for it no longer to be a triplet. So then, the act of performing notation does not involve getting something right, but just playing it in a manner that's not wrong, if you see what I mean. It's a very destructionist view of notation. And this derives a bit from some of Ferneyhough's thoughts on the idea that complex notation channels the performer's creative imagination into directions they would not have gone otherwise. And so within that, then there's a large range of creative possibility for the interpreter, and many ways in which they can also draw upon wider information, documentary, analytical, and other, in order to arrive at interpretive possibilities. But the stress is on the creative role, and the idea that interpretation isn't something on top, but it's actually inherent in the very act of turning a score into sound. So that was a little tangent, but I just want to give you now a few small examples of places where the decisions I would make as a performer do inevitably reflect analytical decisions. And I'm not making any special claims for myself here, because, as I said before, I think this is true for most performers and most performances. One will be something I'm going to play later, the Seventh Symphony's Preludes, Book 2. And I prefer to call it the Prelude number 7, because the title's coming at the end. But the subtitle, let's say, let OSS or Music to Moon. One can take on board the programmatic interpretation to the extent one wishes to, but I think it can also be viewed as an abstract piece. Anyhow, the piece shows a transition from a texture spanning the whole compass of the keyboard, though albeit not in a way to avoid bottom heaviness, as Debussy was so concerned with timbre balance. He only has one note in the lower 2.5 octaves. To then a focus on dense chords within a roughly 3-octave tessitura in the upper half of the instrument, combined with wide voice bass octaves with the 5th. With that idea on Paranimé, there's a major shift in focus towards the central registers, accentuated by other aspects of the change of character from mysticism to playfulness, or at least that's how I understand it. So if the pianist actually releases the low bass sonorities at that point, or releases those B flats, a whole layer of sound evaporates, and that adds extra clarity to the new material, which I think is exactly analogous to either a cinematic zoom or at least a shift of focus. And the repeated low B flat in the second bar of the Paranimé becomes just a residue of the preceding section, no longer given the focus provided by the earlier voicing. almost a programmatic decision, you could say, though there's nothing necessarily implied by the subtitle of the piece. For me, it's a means of adding an extra dramatic element by introducing an isolated moment of intimacy, but clearly informed by the function of the passage in question as one of the few moments which is concentrated in the central registers without regular punctuation within a wider tessitura. The other comes at the end. To look at a different example, also something I'm going to be playing later. In the first movement, Emerson, of Charles Ives' Concord Sonata, there's a relatively clear distinction between an upper melodic line and an accompaniment. But the main lyrical theme from the movement, which I've put at the top here in isolation, is fragmented and reassembled with notable shifts of register. It first appears like this. Now, many performances I hear of the passage underneath that attempt, well, I'm not criticising them for doing this, attempt to contain the material within some sense of continuous line. Personally, I prefer a quasi-cinematic interplay between distinct layers. So, through voicing, rhythm and phrasing, I try to separate these out as if they constitute a type of musical montage, with some continuity between the strands only achieved on the second system. In the movement, the fragmentation is more obvious because of sudden changes of density, which anticipate a series of arpeggios which come soon afterwards. Basic those decisions might be, they would be less clear without prior knowledge of the Emerson theme on the previous page, and as such, I would say they are analytical decisions. So my final example comes from analysis by the American scholar and composer Richard Baudouin of a section from Michael Finnessy's piece Capitalistic Realism, which is from his 5.5-hour cycle The History of Photography and Sound, which I premiered. Baudouin was in this article, which was published in Perspectives of New Music in, I think, 2008. He was concerned to get away from an approach to Finnessy's music. Just clean my other glasses again, which tended to focus upon what I would call the intertextual elements of the music, tended to focus upon the various forms of borrowing and mediation that were involved therein. Baudouin wanted to return to what he called the music itself and attempt a sort of more purely analytical approach to the immanent properties of the work. I have no problem with that. What he does, apart from some straightforward listening to tempo markings and registering of some discontinuities, he takes a very vertical approach to music, identifying what he believes to be near-tonal harmonic progressions in the section of the work. It's very valuable and insightful work, I think, but it does omit the vital element of the performer. In fact, performance and its effects on perception do not really feature at all in Baudouin's article, and so there is no real consideration of how approaches to voicing, phrase shaping, rhythmic emphasis and counter-emphasis, or even tempo flexibility might affect the sounding results, including in terms of its perceived harmonies and tonality. This section, which I am to give the intertextual approach, it extracts a line from Beethoven's String Quartet, Opus 18, number 5 for the bass. Just a bare thread from that. Well, the treble is a series of modified fragments which are drawn randomly from Wagner's Goethe-Dämmerung. But those are not Baudouin's key concern. From the distantly reflecting marking, he asserts that the opening of the passage sounds both stable and open due to the use of a G Aeolian mode with E, and, quote, the stability of the first chord of the section, whose outer voice G octaves are novel in the piece thus far. And then he stresses that the implied E major, with the A flat serving N harmonically as a G sharp, also stresses together with the use of a ninth there, which is then flattened. He claims that the G E flat dyad. I'll talk from the piano here. I think this is probably the best way. So he claims that the G E flat dyad on the second system. It darkens the colour when we are still hearing the E major chord. And so he thinks that darkened thing is reaffirmed, the E major, is reaffirmed by the BE fourth immediately after the previous dyad. And so then the next passage, according to him, forms a 5/7 cadence onto D. So this. It's very quiet, I'll play it quieter. So it's an elaborated, perhaps slightly murkied 5/7 cadence to D with various added notes. I don't necessarily disagree with that reading, or at least aspects of it. And looking in a somewhat more horizontal manner, I would note the low C sharp at the beginning of the last left-hand bar of the second system, reinforced by the C sharps in the next octave. And so how that can be heard as a leading note onto the low D. On the other hand, I think the claim for a long 5/7 pedal harmony is quite weak, as the seventh is only heard once briefly. Only that one short 16th note G is when we hear the seventh. So that to me is not enough to assert a 5/7 cadence there. And it's approached through the supertonic of 5, while there's no major third of the one chord of D, at least not until after the maestoso begins in the next section, onto which that dominant note might then otherwise be able to resolve. But let me try and play it in a manner I think is commensurate with Baudrin's analysis. Now try it this way. Using my notes here. So, what I'm trying to think of, that if you were to have the left hand E played quite strongly at the beginning, then you might get more of an emphasis of a C major harmony which resolves to F to A, whereas also the B flat could be said to lead to the A flat. If I bring out that E more, and I think there's a stronger sense of the C major there, you could treat the F sharp on the next system rather like the 7th degree, the minor 7th degree of A flat, or the dominant 7th there, whereas the E flat could be accentuated to lead onto D sharp, and also one could resolve to onto a weak 6th at the end of C and E. Try and bring this out. Another way of doing this could change the balance between the hands. Try and notice and phase the hands in and out, so that when the left hand's not playing, I would bring right hand somewhat more to the foreground. I could also just do a simple different balance. I always think balance on the piano is an interesting thing, because if one plays two hands in a literally balanced way, they will always sound imbalanced because the bass is naturally swung. So if I play the right hand up a bit. Those are just some of many possibilities, and these are sort of questions I'm always thinking about if playing this type of music. So what I'm trying to say from this is that Baudrin's analysis is an analysis which implies the music being played in a certain way. A different type of performance might provide different sorts of conclusions in terms of the harmonic function. It's often been argued that analysis cannot simply explain existing oral perceptions of work, but also facilitate and stimulate new approaches to listening. And certainly in some of the writings I've written on new music, I've tried to do some of that. But analysis which is oblivious to the role of performance, and which seeks to deny the many creative choices available to performers, even when playing highly detailed scores, is to my mind somewhat limited. On the other hand, I cannot accept the view of Cook and Leach Wilkinson that analysis is of little value for performers, as detailed earlier. On the contrary, I do believe that some form of analysis is at play whenever a performer renders a work of music. How formalised or systematic, or even conscious such analysis is to my mind not really the issue. Performers are making decisions all of the time, and the moment these relate to some perceptions about the score from which they play, or wider knowledge of outputs, composers, styles, genres, etc., and so on, they are engaging in analysis. And there's no reasons why some of the fruits of sophisticated analyses could never be of value to performers. Thank you. Any questions?
Yes, I do have the first one. I hope of many.
Sorry?
I hope of many questions, because thank you very much. It was very interesting. My first question, if I may have more of one.
Of course. Is that actually amplifying or just recording?
Oh.
Just recording, so it wouldn't see it.
Okay, I can speak a little bit stronger. My first question is, first of all, I think for me it is incredible that there are still authors that think perhaps that the intuition does not come together with the analysis. It's for me absolutely altmodisch.
Yes.
How? Yeah.
Old-fashioned.
Old-fashioned, yeah. And what I think perhaps there is also a kind of a political aspect of that, because when you say that the intuition does not go together with the study, that is something Manichaean.
Manichaean, yes.
Yes, and it establishes a kind of moral value, which is really, and also I put together the question of the pedagogic method, because when a teacher say to his student, you have to do like this, because you told what was the expression you used, that he wants to direct prescriptive teaching.
Yeah, prescriptive.
Yeah. That is not a kind of pedagogic approach which helps the student to be active, to make his own choices. And I think there is together the political and the pedagogic aspect, which is actually very, very dangerous.
Well, I encountered this in a masterclass I was doing just last week in Portugal. It was meant to be a artistic research symposium which was going to be working on a contemporary work, but in the end there were problems because the pianist didn't turn up and there wasn't a piano score. So instead, we worked on a piece of Mozart, this violinist, the fifth violin concerto, and just from the opening entry, they played it a certain way, and I said, have you thought of this? And we tried it with differing levels and types of vibrato, different ways of shaping the phrase, depending on whether it was conceived more horizontally or vertically, and even how you could have the dynamic envelope and these vibratos slightly out of phase with each other. For no other reason than just to show how many things are possible with this sort of thing. I think this was very interesting to those who listened to it. They heard how music could be really changed and how it came across. Unfortunately, the student said then, oh, but the way it is with my teacher, you have to do what he says. So he was a Russian teacher, really that didn't surprise me. Said there's no way just you do it my way, and it was sad to see how this sort of fear had been brought about through that. And that's not to say that just anything a young student brings is going to be valid, and there isn't a place for sort of, but not simply in terms of in order to dictate one way, which actually in itself in this case involved a very particular application of style, and in ways that I think would have been anachronistic for playing Mozart anyhow. I wasn't going to sort of say that. But This is why I so object to Nietzsche Wilkinson's idea that well, he used to say that somehow the conservatoire was a place of great freedom as compared to the university, which is a place of authoritarian strictures. If anything, I think it's more the other way around.
I agree. Thank you very much.
If you have a second one, maybe we can come to that after we've had a few other people.
Yeah.
Yes.
Then back. Yes.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So, in which extent do you think that a very complex interview?
So I need to do this. The air conditioning is quite great.
So, in which extent do you think a very complex writing actually prompts you to play with more freedom than like very strict example?
Because I think that very complex scores demand new creative choices of how one can find a way of turning these into sound. An example I've used before, the opening of Brian Furnier's piano piece, Opus Contra Natura, which was written for me, in which he has 4 levels of nested two-foot rhythms in the first phrases, so incredibly detailed. I don't know what it would mean to play this rhythm correctly. I could feed it into a computer, but that would just tell me about the aesthetic priorities of the person who designed the software. So I figured a way that, working up from different levels of tuplet, I thought, you have this amount of space to fit these in, and they want to be roughly even, and they don't want to fall into these other, more evened out patterns. And so I saw these complex rhythms as a corrective to more habituated, familiarized responses. And so this was a way of encouraging me to sort of think creatively of finding new sounds to produce from that. And I think that's a very creative thing.
So do you believe there's like a subtext to most of the complex writing, or?
A subtext wouldn't be the phrase I would use. I suppose I think creativity is something which can be very much informed and learned. I don't think creativity is something that just comes from some divine inspiration or anything like that. But the more one learns, the more one thinks, the more the possibilities for spontaneous and meaningful, intuitive choices are there. And I think a fair number of improvising musicians might not disagree with me on that subject. That it takes a lot of intelligence to be able to improvise well. So yeah, exactly that sort of Manichean dichotomy between sort of intuitive delivery and something which is all over intellectualized and thought. And I don't accept that at all, because it's separating out a sort of brain versus heart in a way I just find hugely simplistic and reflecting the worst types of irrationalist 19th century ideologies. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yes.
Yes.
And a question somewhat related to that, that in the case that a composer may choose to write, basically there's 2 different ways to write something. One way would be easy to read, like Messiaen has an example of that in that book, Technique of Musical Language, and he says that if I'm writing a solo piece, I can use only durations and not even use bar lines, for example, because that transmits better what I want. But technically, you can write the same thing in 4/4 and just link everything in all the durations. So, as a composer, one concern is for the score to show your idea, that if you put into a 4/4, it will be easier to read, but the idea will not be clear. So what is your feeling of that 2 different ways of writing as an interpreter?
Well, notation is concrete. Notation is rarely simply transparent. And things like bar lines are all a question of how one reads something, I would say. I mean, if you have a 4/4, according to a certain set of conventions, that could imply a certain degree of emphasis on the downbeat and a lesser on the third beat, and then the second and fourth. And one should group the notes with relative degrees of intensity according to that, albeit possibly modified by other factors as well. And obviously, if the bar line's not there, there's no necessary reason to believe that, unless other musical aspects clearly imply a grouping into four. How to answer your question in general, that's very difficult to do because I think it so depends on the particular case and the particular desired result in question. When I've done many workshops with composers bringing pieces, I've often been sometimes a bit provocatively saying, your notation might suggest to me I play it like this. If I brought certain assumptions, sometimes playing in a very late romantic manner or something, and I said, there's nothing that tells me not to do it that way. How do I know? And if you want to eliminate certain possibilities, I feel sort of notation is a corrective to certain things which one does not want, in a sense. So if one doesn't want something clearly grouping into fours, in that way I wouldn't write the bar lines. Messiaen's case is very particular, I think. This is the particular, often quite fluid nature of music, but he certainly does use bar lines. I'm playing the Barragard in a month's time, complete again. There's plenty of bar lines in that. So he doesn't tend to use time signatures so often there, which he has to do in ensemble pieces, or, well, I wouldn't fancy trying to get it together otherwise. Does that sort of...
Yeah. Just that this, usually sometimes you write something and the interpreter looks at it and says, why is it so complicated? You could write it easier.
Yes, if you wrote it easier, it would deliver quite different types of results. I find that it's an easy response that a lot of performers have. People say, well, you couldn't possibly execute all of this. Say, okay, but if I wrote it differently, what would come out would be a quite different type of sound. Yeah.
No, actually, I was going to ask something new.
Now it's time to go to the round table. So this is the final ask.
No, but the question was like somewhere around your question and Cynthia's question, because as a composer, I really like those complex pieces, and sometimes people around me just ask, but why you write so complicated? You could just, put approximated durations and approximated places where the notes are, and it would sound like just the same. So, and I don't know. I don't think that's a real correct sentence, because as you've talked, there are some interpretation differences between when it's a more open piece and a more complex and supposedly more fit piece. And
if we look at this case, the 7 and the time of 6 here, some would say, well, why not write this in the space-time notation? Why not just indicate where the beats lie and keep a spatial regularity there? But I think you'd lose a sense of how this is a modified line. Now, the fact 7 times 6 doesn't mean that one should play it necessarily as if were the triplet removed, it should be done in a wholly metronomic manner. There can still be plenty of freedom within that, but it's just getting a sense of multiple pulses at the time, which I think that implication in terms of pulse would not be at all clear if it was notated in such a format. If you know Yanis Nakis' Mists, a piano that has various passages which are beamed groups simultaneously, and other passages which are just note heads. And one of the questions for the performer is how much to sort of stress the difference between those two types of writings, or how much to stress the continuity. I tend towards the former solution, whereas another colleague who's a pianist will go more for the continuity approach. But certainly, what the score seems to apply to almost anyone, I think, is very different when you have those beams or don'ts. So, if someone can come up with something else and demonstrate that the results do not differ significantly, then it is a fair argument. Otherwise, I don't think it is. I thought the round table was a 12, isn't it?
Huh?
Is it a 12 or was it quarter to?
this was a positive.
Oh, right.
It started a little bit later.
Because we started a bit late. Yeah, so I wondered if we could continue to talk about it. And you have a question number 2. And
Mark.
And I want to also thank you for giving the opportunity to make more questions. And first of all, I'm a big admirer of your work and research. And I mean, I don't have any dispute with anything you said because I agree with most of that. But as you were saying, I was wondering, especially when you got this final example, Because I mean, of course I don't agree with Nietzsche Wilkinson claims that analysis has no values, analysis is useless. But I was wondering if which kind of musical analysis he was taking as musical analysis, because maybe some kinds of musical analysis can be useless to performance.
Some of them can be used as any type of analysis. That's, in any sort of discipline, will be good and bad work.
Yes.
He didn't just make analysis; it was musicology in general.
Yes.
And it was at a conference called Performing Musicology, and so he decided to declare that performers should ignore musicologists, except for him, of course. So he wasn't specific on that, but I think from reading elsewhere, he's particularly dismissive towards structural analysis, anything that's looking at long-range aspects of a work of music. He says that he believes that listeners cannot pick up on those sort of things, and uses some empirical texts which some have said are questionable, that says by the time they get to a certain point in the work of music, they will not be able to remember what they've heard before. That may be the case, but that doesn't mean that how they hear the thing at that moment might not be conditioned by the sum total of the experience, the listening experiences up to that point, in my view. So that's why I'm not convinced by that particular empirical test that's employed there. Question?
No, it's about your conclusion.
Yes.
I would like to know what is your what do you mean really with that conclusion? Because it's no, I mean you really think that doing something and being conscious of it is the same thing that doing this thing and not being conscious of it? You understand my point about consciousness?
Yes. And I'd say I'm framing the concept as broadly as I can. I think, yes, I think a lot of things that people do as performers, of which they're not necessarily consciously aware of the reasons, will be informed by other perceptions about the music. Yes, and those ultimately amount to a certain type of analysis. When one's conscious about them, then there's often more the chance of making more choices, I think. But what one does unconsciously might itself be affected by the range of conscious activity one has done prior to that point. And I certainly find that in performance. And I don't actually like to plan too many things before a performance myself. I like to leave certain things to the feeling of the moment, not least because of adapting to the sense of the space and what sort of ambience there is from the audience. But I know that what I will actually do in those circumstances will, even if I'm just thinking, I just feel like that and do it, it will somehow be a learned experience. I really do believe that. So in that sense...
I have a second one.
Sure. I want to have your second question as well, if you get a second one as well.
Just about this idea of, don't you think, in fact, that analysis is also something changing, and we are going to something different that we could call performance-informed analysis?
Certainly, yes. And that's what Cook was advocating in 1999, that analysts should learn from performers. And work like that of Robert Phillip, for example, back in his study of early recordings, is analysis of performance. I teach that to my second-year undergraduates in our music analysis module. It's actually a good way of getting them in, starting off by analysing performances and then trying to get them to think about what the performers do relate to other aspects of the music discernible from the score. So, yes, and with things like what I think is a mixed blessing in the development of sonic visualizer software, which I say it's a mixed blessing because I've seen so many impressive looking spectrograms which tell you something that was really obvious. I read one, actually, I won't say who it is because it's someone I work with sometimes, it was actually a rap track, and he managed to, from the spectrogram, show that there were various smaller climaxes and a bigger one at the end. I would never have imagined it. So that's, I've just seen so many of dressing up very elementary conclusion through these quasi-scientific looking diagrams. Which is not to say that there aren't much more subtle insights can be achieved through that type of software. But the availability of software and the facility it allows in giving a veneer of scientism to analysis, I think is catching on quite a bit, or it has been in the last years. Maybe that process will change. So in that sense, I think performance-informed analysis, PIA, the opposite of AIP, yes, I think it certainly is a growing field. And all things told, I think that's certainly a positive development. You had a second question.
Oh, thank you. I actually think that the analysis and the research, the personal research each performer does every day, can be compared to the actor's work. Right? If we think about what Antonin Artaud or Jerzy Grotowski, they told, because I think there is a lot of work which is done in researching. And I think also that this research is in the harmony and is also in the embodiment of the musical playing, the instrument playing.
Completely, yes.
So I think that paradoxically, that when you work a lot and you research a lot, then you can, like Grotowski says, that you can just start from as it would be the intuition. But this manichaeism doesn't exist actually.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Grotowski's whole core theatre is nothing like the sort of thing people like Wilkinson are holding up as a model of intuition. It's arrived at through considerable effort and through considerable thought. Then that creates the conditions under which such spontaneous creation can occur.
Spontaneous, but choose.
Yeah.
You're right.
Learn, that's the term I think. Yeah. Well, spontaneity doesn't come from nowhere. I think. If you ask a child to spontaneously pick a word, that will depend on how many words they've ever heard. If they've heard hundreds more words, their reservoir of spontaneous possibility is consequently expanded. And I think of this, if I try all sorts of different interpretations when I'm on my own, then the range of things that might come to my spontaneous mind when I'm performing is increased. So yes. No, I very much like the Grotowski analogy, and I might use that sometime. I might credit you. I'll credit you if I do so. So this is what I think should be very, very good. Do we have to go? We've got time for any more questions?
Unfortunately, we should be. Thank you very much.